the stable she slept in for 8 long winters. A Lakota chief set her at his own hearth. I will tell you about the woman who slept in straw. Not my straw. Not yet. Other men's straw, other men's barns, the leavings of a dozen settlements between the Platte and the Powder. 8 winters of it, she told me later, when she could finally say it without her jaw going tight. 8 winters of hay in her hair and mud on her boots, and eating whatever the cook at whatever ranch would set outside for her before dark. The way you'd leave scraps for a dog you weren't sure you wanted around. I did not know any of that the morning I found her. I knew only what I could see, which was a woman, maybe 35, maybe older. Hard living puts years on a face in ways that make counting unreliable. Crouched in the far corner of the remuda pen at the edge of my camp, behind 2 of my best ponies, with a knife in her hand and her eyes on 3 of my younger warriors who had found her there at first light, and were deciding what to think about it. They were not going to hurt her. I want to be clear about that. But they were young men, and young men have a way of standing that makes a cornered person feel like prey even when no harm is meant. I had seen it before. The posture of curiosity that looks like threat. I came through the gate before anyone had to make a decision they would regret. The boys stepped back when they heard me. They always do. I am not a tall man. I have never been tall, but I have been chief of this band for 22 years, and there is a weight that comes with that many years of carrying other people's lives. It is not something you put on like a coat. It settles into how you stand. She did not lower the knife when I came through. That I respected. I stopped about 4 paces from her and did not say anything. The ponies shifted. One of them, the gray mare I call Smoke, because she appears in fog better than she disappears in it, turned her big head and looked at me with that slow, patient expression horses save for situations they've decided are not their problem. The woman's eyes were gray too, or close to it. That pale color that can look almost colorless in flat light. She had dark hair, cut short on one side where it looked like she'd done it herself with a poor blade. Her coat was a man's coat, wool, missing 2 buttons, too big across the shoulders but good and thick. She was shivering. Not from fear, I don't think. It was November. The kind of November that comes off the mountains like an argument you cannot win. I said in English because I could see she was not Lakota, not wholly. You can put that down or keep it. Either way, you are cold and we have a fire. She looked at me for a long time. Then she looked at the 3 boys behind me, still hovering, because they were young and could not help it. I said without turning, "Go." They went. She watched them go, then she looked back at me. Then slowly, she put the knife away, not in a sheath, just pushed it down into the top of her boot, and she stood up straight, which took her a moment because her legs had been cramped in that crouch for who knows how long, and she was stiffer than she wanted to show. She said, "I wasn't stealing your horses." "I know," I said. "You were sleeping behind them because they are warm." That seemed to catch her off guard. Something moved across her face, not quite embarrassment, not quite relief. Something in between that she shut down fast, the way a person does when they've learned that showing any softness is an invitation for something worse to follow. I said, "Come to the fire." She followed me at a distance of about 10 paces. I noticed that. She kept enough space between us that she could run if she had to. I did not close the gap. I let her choose her own distance, and I walked slow, and by the time we reached the main fire she had closed it to maybe 6. My camp was already waking. Women building up the cook fires, children moving between the lodges, the sound of someone splitting wood at the far end. She looked at all of it with a face I couldn't fully read. Not afraid, exactly. More like a person who has been on the outside of things for so long that the sight of ordinary life happening, just happening without her in it, is almost strange. I sat down. After a moment she sat down too, across the fire from me. Walks Far brought us both coffee without being asked. Walks Far is my sister's daughter. She is 24 and sees everything and never makes a point of it, which is the most useful quality a person can have. She set the cups down and left without a word, without a look, without any of the hovering that would have made the woman across the fire feel studied. The woman wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were rough, not rough the way women's hands get from housework or gardening, rough the way hands get from ropes and hard ground and cold that doesn't let up. She drank. I drank. The fire popped. After a while she said, "You're running elk." It wasn't a question. People knew me in this part of the territory. Not always favorably, depending on who was doing the knowing, but they knew the name. I said, "Yes." She said, "They say you're fair." I said, "Who says?" She tilted her head a little. "People." I waited. She said, "I heard there was a Lakota camp 2 days south of the Powder. I was heading there." "You were heading here?" "Yes." "On foot?" "My horse went lame 3 days ago. I left her at a farm outside Reno Creek. The farmer there, he'll keep her." A pause. "He's decent." I thought about that. 3 days on foot, November, alone, sleeping in whatever shelter she could find. She'd found my remuda pen at some point in the night. She hadn't stolen anything. She'd just gotten warm. I said, "Why were you looking for my camp?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "I was told you sometimes take people in, people who don't have anywhere else." I looked at her. She met my eyes steadily. I said, "Who told you that?" "A Métis trader named Cecil on the North Fork last spring." She said the name with a French roll to it, easy and natural. She had spent time with French speakers, or she was one partway. I knew Cecil. Broad woman, one eye slightly off, traded in blankets and information and very good dried venison. If Cecil had pointed this woman toward my camp, it meant something. Cecil did not send me problems. She sent me people. There is a difference. I said, "What is your name?" "Marin," she said, then, "Marin Voss. My mother was French. My father was German, out of St. Louis before he wasn't anything anymore." She said that last part flat without any lean into it. I said, "What happened to your father?" "Cholera," she said, 1861. My mother 2 years after. She paused. I was 17. I did the math without trying to. 17 and 61 put her at 50 now, if I was calculating right. But she didn't look 50. She looked like a woman who had been 50 for a long time already. She was looking at the fire. She said, quieter, "After that I worked where I could. Cooks, laundresses, seamstress work when someone needed it. But she stopped. Started again. I have a tendency to say what I think, and women in that kind of work aren't supposed to say what they think, so I kept losing the positions. I understood that. I had a tendency to say what I think too, and I was chief, so for me it was an asset. For a lone white woman in frontier settlements, it was a death sentence delivered in increments. I said, "And the stables?" Her eyes came up to mine, fast then steadying. She said, "Cecil told you." "Cecil told me nothing. I said stables because that is where you were this morning." She held my gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the fire. Her jaw did that thing I had noticed earlier, the slight tightening, like she was deciding whether to trust the ground she was standing on. She said, "The last few years it's been wherever was out of the wind. Barns mostly. Sometimes a church if the minister didn't mind, which most of them did." A pause. "You learn which settlements are worth trying and which will run you off before dark." I said nothing. She said, 8 winters of it." The fire popped again. Smoke pulled sideways in a gust and then straightened. "I have been chief of this band for 22 years. I have made decisions in that time that I cannot unmake. I have sent men into danger because the danger was necessary. I have turned people away when to take them in would have put my own people at risk. I have held the line between what I wanted to do and what was right to do, And sometimes those are the same thing and sometimes they are not, and you learn to tell the difference. This was the same thing. I said, "There is a lodge at the south end of camp. It belonged to my wife. She died 4 years ago in the spring." Marin said nothing. She was listening. I said, "It has been empty. I have not had a use for it." She was very still. I said, "You will stay there. You will have what you need. Food from the communal store the same as anyone else in this camp. Wood cut and stacked. A good horse when yours is returned, or another if she cannot be brought back." She said, "What would you want in return?" I looked at her. "What do you have to offer?" Not unkindly, a real question. She thought about it seriously, which I appreciated. She did not make the offer I had been careful not to invite. She said, "I can cook. I can sew, and I'm good at it, better than I am at most things. I can dress a wound, set a bone if it isn't too complicated. I speak French and German and some Cheyenne." A pause. "And I'm good with horses." I said, "I know." She blinked. I said, "You were in my remuda pen for 3 hours this morning. Smoke does not allow people near her. She was standing with her hip against your shoulder when the boys found you." Something crossed her face then, something I had not seen yet. Not relief, not gratitude, not the shut-down wariness she kept as a default. Something older and simpler than any of that. Like a knot in a rope that had been pulled tight for years and someone had just taken the tension off. She said, "Cecil said you were fair, a beat. She didn't say you were observant." I said, "She did not need to." She almost smiled. It didn't quite land, but it was close. The architecture of a smile, the way a thing looks right before it arrives. I said, "Finish your coffee. Walks far will show you the lodge." That was how it started. I want to be honest with you. There is a version of this story where I tell you I knew from that first morning what she would become to me. Men tell that kind of story. I have heard it many times. The moment I saw her, the instant she turned. That is not how it was. What I knew that first morning was that she was a woman who had been ground down to something close to nothing by 8 winters of being nobody's responsibility, and that I had the means to change that, and that changing it was right. That was the whole of it. Clean and simple, the way real decisions usually are when you stop dressing them up. What came after was slower. She moved into the lodge that afternoon. Walks far helped her air it out. The bedding had gone musty, which I should have thought about sooner, but hadn't, and between them they had it set right by evening. I heard them talking while I was working with the horses. Not the words, just the sound of it. 2 women's voices in a space that had been quiet for 4 years. I stood for a moment and listened to that. Then I went back to work. The first week she was quiet. Not withdrawn exactly, more like a person learning the shape of a new place before trusting their weight to it. She watched more than she spoke. She showed up where she could be useful without being asked, without making a show of it. She noticed Walks Far's youngest daughter had a cough, and appeared the next morning with a poultice that smelled like pine and something else I couldn't name, and the cough was gone in 3 days. She helped the older women flesh a hide and kept pace with them and didn't complain about her hands afterward, though I saw her flexing them that evening by the fire. She did not come to my lodge. She did not seek me out. I noticed that too. The second week there was an incident with one of the new men in camp, a young brule who had come to us from a band further east, good rider, not much else to recommend him yet, still sorting out how to behave. He said something to Marin near the cook fire that I didn't hear directly but that Walks Far heard, and Walks Far told me with her face, set in the particular way it sets when she thinks I need to know something, but isn't going to make it dramatic. I found him and I spoke to him. I will not repeat what I said. It was brief and it was sufficient, and he did not look in Marin's direction wrong again. I did not tell her I had done it. She found out anyway. Walks Far, most likely, or the way things filter through a camp. Nothing stays hidden long in a place this size, which is both a difficulty and a safeguard. She came to find me that evening while I was checking on a horse that had thrown a shoe, and she stood in the entrance of the stable and said, "You didn't have to do that." I said without looking up, "Yes, I did." She was quiet. I finished checking the hoof, set the leg down, straightened up. She was looking at me with that gray or close to it gaze, and there was something in it I wasn't sure how to name. Not softness, exactly. Something more solid than soft. The way certain kinds of trust look from the outside, not the easy trust of someone who believes in you before they have reason to, but the harder kind that comes from watching a person and deciding. She said, "Cecil told me you'd buried 2 wives and never stopped being a fair man." I said, "Cecil talks too much." She said, "She talks exactly the right amount." I looked at her. She held my gaze. Then she said, "Thank you." She said it plain, no flourish, the way a person says something they mean, and she left. I stood in the stable for a while after in the smell of horse and hay and cold air, and I thought about what it meant to be seen, not celebrated, not made into something larger, just seen, accurately, by a person who had looked at you with clear eyes and decided. It is a rarer thing than it should be. December came hard. We had 3 days of a blizzard that would have been bad in a good year, and was worse this year, because we'd lost 2 of the older buffalo hunters in September to a sickness that had also taken the very young and the very old in unusual numbers. The camp was thinner than I wanted it, thinner than felt safe, and the storm drove us all inside and kept us there, and the question of what we had, and how long it would last became the question that sat in the center of every conversation. I was not worried about starvation. We had enough. But enough in a hard winter is a number you watch every day, and watching it is its own kind of weight. On the second night of the blizzard, I was still awake well past when I should have been, going over what I knew and what I didn't know, and what decisions I needed to make before the storm broke. The camp was quiet. The wind was not. It was the kind of wind that finds every gap and puts its voice in it, and the sound it made was not a comforting sound. A knock at my lodge pole. I said, "Come." Marin came in bringing cold air and a pot wrapped in a piece of blanket. She set it on the stone near the fire and looked at me with the expression of a person who has made a decision and is not going to defend it. She said, "You haven't eaten since this morning." I said, "How do you know that?" She said, "Because I watched." She poured something into a bowl, venison broth, thick, with dried beans and something I couldn't identify, but that smelled like the sage that grew on the south-facing slope before the snow covered it. She held it out. I took it. She sat down on the other side of the fire, not across it exactly, a little to the side, and she pulled her coat tighter and looked at the fire, and I ate, and we were quiet. After a while she said, "What are you worried about?" I said, "What makes you think I'm worried?" She said, "You have a way of going still when something is on your mind, like a man standing at the edge of ice, deciding whether it'll hold." I looked at her. She shrugged. "I've watched a lot of men. You learn to read them." I thought about what to say. Normally I keep the weight of the band's concerns inside myself, not because I think I should carry them alone, but because showing the weight to the wrong person makes the weight heavier, not lighter. They start adding their worry to yours, and then you are carrying too. But she wasn't that kind of person. I already knew that. I told her about the numbers, the food, the wood, what we'd need to last until the Chinook winds came and the prairie opened up again. Not all of it, the parts that had a shape she could hold. She listened without interrupting, which is its own kind of skill. When I was done, she said, "The family in the third lodge from the eastern entrance, the Brings Water family. The old man is a hunter, but the 2 boys aren't yet. And they burned through their wood faster than anyone expected because the old woman is sick, and they're keeping the fire high." I looked at her. She said, I know where there's a stand of dead timber on the South Creek, maybe a mile. Dry wood, good wood enough to carry us if it's cut and split before the ground freezes harder. I found it in the fall. I was going to say something, but a pause. I didn't know if it was my place. I said, "It is your place." She looked at me steadily. I said, "You live here. It is your camp as much as anyone's." I watched that land on her. The way a thing lands when it fills a space a person has been keeping empty, not because they wanted it empty, but because they had learned to stop expecting it to be filled. She didn't say anything. She just held the look I gave her for a moment, and then she looked back at the fire. In the morning, when the wind had dropped enough to work in, I took 4 men to the South Creek with her, and we cut and split timber for 2 days and stacked it against the Brings Water Lodge and 4 others. She worked alongside us. She did not slow us down. There was a thing that happened in February that I should tell you, because it is where the story turns, or where I understood the story had already turned without my noticing. A man came. White man, maybe 40, trail-worn, rode into camp with the look of someone who had followed a track for a long time and was finally at the end of it. He said his name was Doyle, and he wanted to speak to the chief. And when they brought him to me, he looked me over in the way white men sometimes do when they have expectations of what a chief ought to look like, and I have disappointed those expectations. He said, "I'm looking for a woman, goes by Marin Voss." I said, "What do you want with her?" He said, "That's between her and me." I said, "It is between you and me first." He looked at me again. Recalibrating, he said, "She walked out on a position. Left a family in Laramie without a cook and without giving notice. Took a horse that wasn't hers." I said, "Was the horse returned?" He hesitated. He said, "That's not the point." I said, "Where is the horse now?" He said it was brought back, but the family. I said, "Then there is no horse. Is there a warrant?" He said slower now, "No." I said, "Then what you have is a grievance, and you have ridden it a long way." He sat on that for a moment. He was trying to figure out how angry he should be and whether being angry would help him. He decided it wouldn't. He said, "I'd like to speak to her." I said, "She is not here," which was true. She was at the South Creek cutting the last of the timber, because she had said the stand still had good wood in it, and she wanted to finish it before the February thaw made the footing bad. He said, "I'll wait." I said, "No." He looked at me. I said, plain and level, the way I say things when I have decided. "There is no warrant. There is no horse. You have ridden a long way for a grievance that has no remedy I am required to provide. You are welcome to camp tonight in the field to the east, and I will send food. In the morning you will leave." He held my gaze for a long time. He was deciding the same thing he had decided before, whether anger would help him, and arriving at the same conclusion. He said, "This isn't your business." I said, "She lives in my camp." A pause. "Everything in my camp is my business." He left the next morning. I had 2 of the younger men ride out with him for 5 miles, not threatening, just present, until there was no question about the direction he was going. I did not tell Marin that evening. I told her in the morning when he was gone, so there would be nothing to be afraid of and nothing to do but know it was handled. She found me by the remuda pen. She said, "Walks far told me about the man." I said, "It's done." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" I said, "Because there was no warrant and no horse, and a man who rides that far for a grievance is not looking for justice." She said, "I'm asking why you protected me." I said, "You know why." She said, "I want to hear it." I looked at her. The February light was flat and white, the kind of light that takes shadows off a face and shows you just the face itself. I had looked at her many times by then. I knew the line of her jaw and the set of her eyes and the way she tucked her chin slightly when she was deciding whether to say a hard thing. I said, because you are mine to protect. Not possessive, not ownership. The other thing, the older thing, the one that doesn't have a clean word for it in English. The word we have in Lakota is closer to responsibility as an honor. A thing you carry because it is yours to carry, and carrying it well is what makes a man. She understood it. I could see she understood it. She stepped forward and put her hand flat against my chest, just over my heart, just for a moment, and she looked up at me. Her eyes were that gray that was almost no color, and they were very clear. She said, "Then I'm staying." Not as a question, not as a negotiation. As a fact, she had already decided that she was giving me now the way you give a person something you've been carrying for a while, and have decided they're the one to keep it. I put my hand over hers. We stood there in the flat February light, in the cold, in the quiet. That was all, that was plenty. Spring came the way it comes on the high plains, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. Cold one day, warm the next, mud in the afternoon, and frost again by morning. The prairie woke up in pieces, the sage first and then the grasses, the creek running high with melt and loud enough that you could hear it at night from inside the lodge. Marin's horse came back in April. The farmer from Reno Creek brought her himself, a decent man like she'd said, and we fed him, and he stayed a night and was on his way. The mare was sound and well kept. Marin ran her hands down each leg and checked each hoof and looked at her teeth, and generally went over her the way a person goes over something they were afraid they'd lost. Then she looked at me and said, "She'll need a few weeks before she's trail ready." I said, "That is fine." She said, "I wasn't planning to go anywhere." I said, "I know." She said, "I just wanted to say it plainly." I said, "I appreciate that." She laughed. The first time I had heard her laugh full out, not the held-back near smile, but the real thing, low and a little rough, like something that didn't get out often but felt good when it did. We were standing in the remuda pen. The gray mare Smoke came over and pushed her big head into Marin's shoulder the way she always did, because Smoke had been doing that since November and saw no reason to stop. Marin's horse, the returned one, a sorrel I later learned she called Rabbit for reasons she never fully explained, stood nearby looking at Smoke with the patient suspicion of a horse assessing a new neighbor. The spring light was good, warm on my face. I have been chief of this band for 22 years. I have made decisions in that time that cost something, and decisions that gained something, and decisions that did both, and decisions I cannot unmake. A man in my position learns to tell the difference between a thing that is good for him and a thing that is good, and learns to want the ones that are both. Marin had come into my camp in November with a knife in her boot and 8 winters of straw in her hair, and not much else. She had stayed the winter and worked alongside my people, and told me the hard things I needed to know, and said plainly what she meant, and stood in the flat February light, and put her hand against my heart and called herself mine. She had not needed saving. That is what I want you to understand. She had needed a door left open, and a fire, and a man who would say this is your camp as much as anyone's and mean it, and who would ride out a man with a grievance and not make a production of it. I had done those things. I had done them because it was right to do them, and because she was mine to protect, and because a man who has the means to do right and turns away from it is diminished. That's a plain fact. But I will tell you something else, also plain, that I don't say lightly. I had been alone for 4 years. Not friendless. I have my band, my sister's family, men and women I have known my whole life, but alone in the other way. The way a person is alone when there is no one who looks at you and sees the weight you carry and wants to understand it, not to lighten it, but just to know it's there. Marin saw the weight. She didn't try to take it. She knew better. But she saw it clear-eyed the way she saw everything, and she was there, and that was the difference. She is there now. The lodge that was empty is not empty. The fire that burned low at night burns better. Walks Far's youngest calls her aunt. which was not suggested by anyone and was not resisted by anyone either, because some things arrive exactly as they should, and you don't need to give them names to know what they are. I am running elk, chief of this band for 22 years, and I am not a sentimental man. I say that knowing you will judge the accuracy of the claim against everything I have just told you. Judge it how you like. She is at my hearth. She is there of her own will, same as she stays of her own will, same as she looked at me in February with those clear gray eyes and said I'm staying the way you say a thing you have decided down to the bone. That is worth more than I have words for in any language I speak, and I speak 3. Outside, the creek is running loud with the last of the melt. Smoke has her hip against the fence post, asleep on her feet. Rabbit is grazing about 20 yards out, suspicious of everything and content. And in the lodge that was empty, Marin is sewing by the fire, saying nothing, because there is nothing that needs to be said. Some things you don't need to say. You just keep them,